Okay, this is my first time ever doing anything like this. I don't necessarily like this formatting, but emergency times call for emergency measures. So we're just going to jump in. I'm going to try to get this done. I can't promise you video quality. I can't promise you entertainment, but we're going to try to get through this as smoothly as we possibly can. So today's lecture, if you guys remember from before spring break, is absolutely going to be the other half of the 20s. All of the stuff that I told you guys was the unpleasant aspects of the 20s. That's the stuff that we're going to work on and focus on through this lecture. The way this lecture works is I have a whole lot of video links and whatnot that I really wanted you guys to listen to and watch. Those video links are in the PowerPoint presentation. And so it's going to be absolutely vital that you look at the PowerPoint presentation as well as the lecture. So when you're watching these lectures, the thing that I can recommend the most is go ahead and download the PowerPoint presentation that goes with it and have the PowerPoint presentation up. That way I can be like, now we're going to pause and watch the corresponding video. So you don't have to be looking at the PowerPoint necessarily while you're doing the lecture, because I understand that that's just too much, but I'll tell you when to pause in the lecture, and then you can switch over to the PowerPoint presentation. You can watch or listen to the video, whichever one is more, whichever one is relevant for that particular time, but it should all be in there, and we should be able to together get through this. And hopefully the more I do these recorded lectures, the better I'll get at them, because right now it just feels very odd and off-putting. So anyway, today is the other 20s. Your keywords are Amos and Andy, the Registry Act, and Prohibition. Those are the words that you will see some combination of on the test. If you've looked at the updated syllabus, you will take note that instead of multiple choice, we're dropping that and going to 10 IDs and one essay. And the 10 IDs are going to be just like the extra credit in the first test that you guys did. So it should not be anything surprising or different. Those words I will pull from the PowerPoint, so they're words that you should absolutely be familiar with by the time we're going through. This is also going to prove very difficult for me because, as you know, in class I pace a lot and I'm used to walking and kind of doing different things while I'm lecturing, and so I don't quite know what to do with my hands or my body while I'm trying to get these done. So again, this is going to be a little bit of trial and error for me as we make our way through this new existence that we're in right now. So today, we're going to talk about the less pleasant aspects of the 20s. We already know that. History is very messy, and despite the fact that people like to talk about golden ages, there's no real golden age. Every single part of history has had some sort of backlash or some bad aspects. It's not, there's no perfect time, and different times have different problems, of course. And in a history class, we're going to focus on the very good and the very bad. That's what we do. And so we've looked at the good, and today we're going to look at the bad. On the economic front, growth isn't the whole picture. Averages did go up in wages, but averages obscure things. We've already talked about that in class, and it's important that we remember that as we're going through these lectures, is that averages absolutely can obscure. Because what's happening in the 20s is this rising inequality. There is, as the economy is growing, more of that growth and more of that profit is going to the top. It's going to the top tier. And debt is also rising. Remember, we talked about the growth of consumer debt. We talked about consumerism. We already went over how there's new ways to finance things. So people are accruing debt that they didn't know about or have before this time period. And so debt is also rising. Debt and inequality together are becoming a problem in the 1920s as payment plans are increasing, as people are financing things. Um, and there's the averages also kind of obscure those, they hide those that didn't see economic rises. When you look at numbers and percentages alone, by 1930, you still have 4% of the 40%, not 40% of the population that is living in poverty. 40%, that's a very high number. Um, and wages are rising, but you have to remember, we've talked a lot about what people make, the money they make. We've talked about what wages were like. So yes, their wages increase, but they were starting from very, very low places. And so they're still, even though they're higher, they're still much lower than they should have been to begin with. And the majority of Americans have nothing. They have nothing saved. They live very much paycheck to paycheck. I would argue that, that's very similar to today. I think that most Americans, kind of myself included, we live in this paycheck to paycheck type of structure. It's pretty common. Or if you're a farmer, and these farmers, they lived harvest to harvest. And there's no financial security for most Americans. And of course, in 1929, there's going to be a significant financial downturn, which we'll talk about as we continue. So even though on average wages are rising, most Americans are living in a very precarious position. And they're living with this knowledge that disaster can just loom around any corner. The slightest thing when you're living paycheck to paycheck can totally devastate your family. I think, we still see instances of that today. We're seeing it now with this COVID-19 because so many people are having to stay home from work and they're not getting paid. And we don't even know yet what the ramifications of that are going to be. And so during this time period, despite the fact that wages are rising, despite the fact that the economy is on an upswing, we still have a lot of financial insecurity that's happening for these Americans in the 1920s. For farmers, individual farmers are now having to compete with corporate farms, big farms. And that's very difficult to do, and it gets harder and harder to do as innovations are coming about that are replacing human labor. So you have these big corporations that can afford all this really innovative technology, and they don't need humans to do the work anymore, and all of that is leading to difficult agricultural times. In fact, if you look at data from the late 1800s into the 1920s, the number of farms fell from 32 million to only 12.5 million by 1930. So that alone tells you how much of a hit farmers, individual farmers particularly, took during this time period. And so farmers and individual farmers are being forced to sell their farms, or they're just losing their farms outright. In addition, those who are left behind, there's a lot of people left behind in the 20s. So despite the fact that there's a lot of growth in the 20s, there's a lot of categories of people that aren't included in that growth. And of course, the number one group that we have to look at when we talk about this are African Americans. Despite the Harlem Renaissance that we talked about, there's very few economic rewards for African Americans during the 1920s. Most of them are still living in poverty in the South. And for those that had moved to the North for those jobs during the Great Migration, they're going to lose them when whites return to the U.S. after the war. So when the soldiers come back, all of those African Americans, and not all of them, but a big majority of them are going to lose the jobs that they moved to the North to take. And that's going to cause a lot of problems as well. Um, you also have the 1920s is also an era that is, it's anti-union. You have the National Association of Manufacturing American Plan. The National Association of Manufacturing American Plan. That's a mouthful. Um, and what the plan is designed to do is to eliminate unions in the U.S., to get rid of their influence. And they're pretty darn successful at it, quite honestly. The better wages that employees did experience during this time period um, kind of, contributed to that. It helped lead to this plan to get rid of unions. It's also due to efforts to completely squash unions too. So you have unions hurt by the increase in wages that a lot of workers experienced, and then you also have these very enthusiastic measures that are taken to kind of get rid of unions as well. Um, and so labor union membership fell from 5.1 to 3.6 million. And the labor movement kind of goes on retreat. As we've previously talked about, the labor movement is often met with measures of violence, especially in mining. It's going to happen quite a bit. In the 1920s, the UMWA is going to be particularly active. That is the union for one of the unions for miners. In 1921, you have the Battle of Blair Mountain, and that's happening in the midst of the American plan to get rid of unions. Um, and it occurs in West Virginia, and this is one of those times when you need to pause the lecture and go watch the video in the PowerPoint presentation. So there is a link to a video on the Battle of Blair Mountain, which is a strike that is particularly deadly. In fact, you see the U.S. people dropping bombs on other U.S. people. They truly do. They go in and they very physically commit acts of violence against these miners who are still experiencing such terrible working conditions and pay even into the 1920s when it was improving for so many other industries, but really not reaching Virginia and Colorado and all the mining states. And so what happens is you see an armed uprising of 5 to 10,000 workers that's going to be met with troops. This event, this uprising is going to crush the UMWV for more than a decade. It's going to greatly hurt the labor movement. Last time we talked about all these different fun parts that are changing in the 20s, like speakeasies and movie theaters and music and dance clubs and all of these fun, fantastic mass forms of entertainment. But there's a downside to that because let's be honest, there's always somewhat of a downside. And so the downside here is it's important for us to look at and understand the content that Americans are ingesting during the 1920s, because not all content is great content. And so it's very important for us to look at what these people were consuming during the 1920s. We already talked about Birth of a Nation. We already watched the clips from Birth of a Nation. So you have to remember, we talked about that movie was in circulation for years and years. And it's still showing in the 1920s. So this is still something that these people are ingesting, digesting, analyzing. It's something that has a really big impact on the nation. And then you have The Jazz Singer, which is released in 1927, and it is the first full-length talkie movie. It's put out by Warner Brothers, and it was the most profitable film of the 1920s. Um, so that all sounds really good, right? Well, the problem with that is what it's about. It's loosely based on the life of the lead actor, whose name was Al Jolson. He was an American-born son of conservative Russian Jews in New York. His parents were extremely religious, but he was a fully assimilated American. Um, and he wanted to be a jazz singer. He was forced to leave home because of his conservative parents who did not support his ambitions to be in the music industry. Um, and at the end of the movie, he has this huge concert that his parents attend, and he reconciles with his parents, and it's this great immigrant success story. The problem with this great immigrant success story is that he performs jazz in blackface with very racist caricatures. With a lot of stereotypes. And this is another point where I want you to pause the lecture, go to the PowerPoint, and click the link. If for any reason the link has been deactivated or is not down, because YouTube changes these things daily, then you can also go to YouTube and type in The Jazz Singer Final Concert, and it's going to be in there. You shouldn't have a problem. The link shouldn't be deactivated. Um, but I have to put that disclaimer out there because many times YouTube does change what they allow you to have access to. Um, and so when you watch that, you'll see that it is a big mockery. So now you've watched the video, you've unpaused the lecture, we're back to talking, and you should have noticed that it's a big mockery. The words that he says, the way that he kind of says them, everything in that performance is a mockery. And people who wear blackface, um, you know, it's all involved in this very complex racist mentality. And he himself, what's so weird about The Jazz Singer is the lead actor who does this, Al Jolson, absolutely was an activist for equality, and most of the people he associated with in his private life were African Americans. So it's very odd that he chose to do that. Um, it's very odd. Now, if we move on to the next part of mass entertainment and the problems with what people are digesting, we have to look at something called Amos and Andy. Amos and Andy was a radio show. It was hands down the most popular radio show in the 1920s in the United States. There's several worker accounts where different industrial workers talk about walking home after their shift, and they say that they could listen to a whole episode while walking home because every single house had Amos and Andy streaming, you know, on the radio, and most of the houses have the windows open, the volume is up. And so even workers walking home and not home yet are able to stay up to date and current on Amos and Andy. That's how popular this show was. So why is it a problem? Because if we're talking about it, we're talking about it in this lecture, that means there's an issue. So what is the issue that's happening with Amos and Andy? Well, the problem is that it follows, the plot of the show is that it follows two bumbling African American characters who moved from the rural South to the North, to Harlem specifically, in the Great Migration. And it is this radio show that two actors who portray Amos and Andy are two whites who perform in blackface, which is even worse because they're in a studio, they're not on television, and they're still being they're still performing in blackface, which makes very little sense. The two characters, the driving plot is that these two African Americans misuse big words. It's another caricature downplaying the intelligence of African Americans. Um, and again, you're going to pause me and go to the PowerPoint presentation and click on the Amos and Andy link. Again, you should have absolutely no problems with this. Most of the stuff is public domain, so there should be no issue. If you do, again, Google Amos and Andy, and I think every episode is on YouTube, but the one that I posted should be there with little to no problems. And so, if you now have watched this video and listened to it, because it's not really a video, it's a sound clip. But if you listen to it, I know it's old and the recording isn't great, but you can hear that they are misusing words, mispronouncing words, saying very odd things. And by utilizing blackface, this was a way to feel superior to a group that is being mocked. Life was never as bad as that, is what they're trying to say. They're trying to justify existing in Jim Crow. And what I mean by that is that if they make these African Americans out to look like idiots, to look like that they're incapable of understanding things like politics, well, then they can justify the reasons why they don't let them vote. They can justify segregation and Jim Crow by saying, look, you know, they don't understand politics. They don't understand big words. They can't really be part of the intellectual community. And again, it's important to stress, and I think that it goes without saying, but I still like to say it, that of course all of these assumptions are completely and totally false. And as a society, we know that they are completely and totally false, but this is a very different time. And so it's important to remember that people are hearing these radio shows and they're believing what they're hearing, and it's really feeding into the stereotypes of minorities during the Jim Crow South. And all of this gives a sense of unity against blacks, and this all kind of contributes and makes worse the heyday of the KKK. This is the absolute peak of the KKK during the 1920s. The first half of the 20s, the KKK becomes normal and very mainstream, which is hard for us to really understand. I mean, for the most part, it's scary. The last couple of years, we've seen this kind of resurgence and some like hate groups and whatnot, but it still cannot compare to how normalized the KKK was during the 1920s. They have marches across the nation and they don't even hide their identity. They didn't feel like they had to. And so the things that they preach about during the 1920s is that they're going to shield the sanctity of the home. They're going to bring back pure womanhood, ideas of white supremacy, um, this idea of pure Americanism, pure womanhood. Their vision of the United States is one that is male, Protestant, and white. And they create this idea of what the good U.S. citizen is. They create this idea that the perfect U.S. citizen is natural born, not immigrant, uh, white, and Protestant. They're very anti-Catholic. They're anti-Jewish. They're anti-Catholic. In fact, they had a lot of propaganda printed that shows them stomping on the Pope's hat because they are very against Catholics. They take up the idea of prohibition. They say that alcohol is immoral, and they consider themselves the informal enforcers of prohibition. Um, and there is this renewed emphasis on anti-Catholicism. And a lot of that feeds into the fear of Italian immigrants because Italians are largely Catholic. And there is a lot of fear of Italian immigrants that's spreading at this time. So they bring up ideas like we want to keep Bibles in school, we want to protect the Protestant religion in school. They try to make it all about morality, religion, and race. All of those things they say define what it means to be a good American. And there is widespread acceptance of these ideas. Um, and it's it's important for you to understand that this isn't something that's just happening in the South. They have really large concentrations of KKK members in Indiana, in Washington. It's not only happening in the South, it's happening throughout the whole United States. It's very normal to see KKK parades. Um, and they have protection of U.S. freedom fairs, stressing the importance of white Protestant Americans. They have better baby contests. They have Klan weddings. They have KKK baseball teams. What was interesting about the KKK baseball teams is sometimes they would have to play Jewish baseball teams, and sometimes they would have to play African American baseball teams. There's college chapters of the KKK. They have inner fraternities associated with the KKK. And if you go look at old college yearbooks, it's really quite interesting and disturbing that they have KKK pictures. So like they have college chapters of the KKK that all their members are, there's pictures of them, their members are listed, all of that information can be found in old college yearbooks. In Illinois, they have 4 million members by 1925. Um, only dues paying members, and that's only counting dues payers members. So what I mean by that is you could pay dues to be a protected member of the KKK. So there were a lot of people who supported the KKK and considered themselves part of the KKK, but they did not pay dues. So we only have numbers on the dues paying members of the KKK. And by 1925, I don't know why I said Illinois because that was wrong. And unfortunately, these are recorded lectures that I'm not going to do over and over again. So I'm letting you know now, Illinois did not have 4 million members itself. The United States as a whole had 4 million KKK members. Hopefully, as I make more and more of these recorded web lectures, they're going to be a little smoother with less mistakes. But I also want to call them out when I see them because, again, I really just can't go back and redo these hours and hours worth of lectures. So we're just going to move through them as we go. And I mean, if I was in class and if you were listening to me, I'd have a hiccup here and there. So maybe it makes it more authentic or it makes it feel realer this way. I don't really know. Anyway, there are more Klan members by 1925 than there are Union members. which is very scary. And so, if there's that many members, imagine how influential they are. That's what's really important about that. Hundreds of Klan members are elected to office. They serve as sheriffs, they're mayors, they're governors. Like in Indiana and Georgia, we know for sure that they had Klan governors. We have senators from Texas. Um, we have all of these politicians that are Klan members. So, of course, you have Klan members who are writing, voting on, and passing legislation that applies to the entire country. And that's, quite terrifying. You have some of them that are even going to become justices in the Supreme Court. Um, and so they have influence that's going to cross party lines. I mean, in the South, it is Democrats, but other places, Republicans and Democrats are members of the Klan and are exerting influence on behalf of the Klan outside of just the Democratic Party. So it's not just drawn by party lines at this time. And you have paid lobbyists. We all know about lobbyists because we talk a lot about lobbyists in everyday life. Like people complain about lobbyists all the time. And so the KKK had paid lobbyists during this time period, which is scary. So they're whining and dining senators and vice presidents and all sorts of people who are key decision makers on policy. Um, and so, again, that's something that we need to understand. Um, absolutely. You also have where they pressure Congress to appoint KKK members to different trade commissions, to different committees that are handling U.S. policy, like trade policies and interstate commerce policies, because they want to avoid regulations. There are hundreds of violent assaults and dozens of murders and lynchings during the 20s, during this rise of the KKK. But there's such strong Klan influence with sheriffs and with police departments that they're very rarely punished for these. In 1925, in fact, David Stevenson, who was the leader of the Klan, he was the leader of the whole Klan in the United States, and he was tried and convicted of raping and murdering a white school teacher. And that says a lot because the KKK got a lot of their support and a lot of their membership from these ideas of championing like true womanhood and pure womanhood and protecting women and protecting children. And yet here's the top of the KKK, and he's now going to be found guilty of murdering and raping a white woman that his organization claims to protect. And so that is going to cause a lot of support for the KKK to fall. They're going to lose a whole lot of support after that. It definitely hits its peak in 1925. And then after the scandal, there is a big loss of influence and popularity. For sure. But what happens is that happens in 1925. And in 1924, we get the first most comprehensive immigration policy to hit the United States. That is the Johnson-Reed Act. That is going to be passed in 1924. And it institutes the new quota system that we've already talked about, not in complete detail, but it is something that we have mentioned, is that we're going to start seeing these immigration regulations. And the first comprehensive one is the Johnson-Reed Act. And it does, it also introduces new elements of immigration law that is going to have a big effects on the United States. It did away with statutes of limitation for deportation. And it is a civil law that is not subjected to the Bill of Rights. And so what it does too, that's very important, is it actually made it unlawful it made unlawful entry itself a deportable offense because it wasn't before. So if you entered into the United States after the 1924 Johnson-Reed Act and you did so illegally, if you did so without going through all the immigration measures that are put into place, then that is actually committing a crime that is seen as deportable. So now just the act of entering into the country without legal permission is enough to have you sent back and deported. Before, that was not automatically a deportable offense. And so what this also does is it creates a permanent illegal status for those who enter unlawfully. They will now belong to an excluded class, and that's going to also set up all of these other things that have to be done. How do we deal with people who are now entering unlawfully? How do we deport them? How do we, it creates this whole new legal apparatus to go about enforcing these immigration laws. And it's easier said than done to enforce it, of course. It doesn't mean that all banned and limited groups stop coming. There will be some. Every month, thousands will enter illegally through the U.S.-Canadian border or through the U.S.-Mexican border or through Cuba. You have a wave of unauthorized European immigrants in the 1920s. You also have Asians immigrating, and they're fully barred. Like Asian immigration is fully barred, and it had been since the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1872 that we already talked about. So what they're doing is they're disguising themselves as Mexican and coming through as Mexican immigrants instead of Chinese. And these are primarily Europeans, though. In 1929, Congress passes the Registry Act, which hopes to kind of address this issue and hopes to figure out what to do about it. So what the Registry Act did is it set a path to citizenship. It set a way to become a legal citizen as long as you weren't an undesirable. So you couldn't be a criminal. You couldn't be crippled, none of those things. So you couldn't fall into those categories that they were not allowing entry. But as long as you weren't one of those, if you were in the country illegally, this gave you a way to become a lawful citizen so that you could not be deported. By 1940, 15,000 unlawful immigrants had registered through the Registry Act. Another system developed that is called pre-examination. So what that said was that if you had come into the country illegally, you could then opt to be pre-screened, and then you would get pre-screened, you would exit the country, and then you would re-enter as a legal resident. Over 200,000 Europeans legalized their citizenship in the United States through this pre-examination thing. And the reason why this is important is because there's so many debates about immigration today. It's one of the #1 campaign points when you're looking at the presidential campaign for 2020. And one of the things that a lot of politicians say is that it's very hard to find a path to citizenship, that there's no precedent for a path to citizenship. But there absolutely was. The Registry Act and the Pre-Examination Act both created this precedent for ways to incorporate unlawful entry citizens into lawful citizens. This time period is also a time of limited progress for women. It limits, there's limits to new roles for women. We talked about flappers and some of the advancements that women made last time, but it's not great. And this can be seen in ads, like cigarette ads. They're smoking women, but they have messages like women can remain slim if they smoke instead of eat. So it's very backwards, and we're still pushing women into this frame of how they should look and how they should act. You guys have an online assignment coming up that is going to ask you to look at advertisement from the 40s and 50s. And that's one of the things that you're going to want to do is look at who they're targeting, how they're targeting, and what they're saying to different groups of people. So keep that in mind when you go through. You also have a lot of cleaning and cooking things that are targeted at women, and they say things like, be done with the housework by 9 a.m. And Another goal that the women had really pushed for was an equal rights amendment to the Constitution, because that doesn't actually exist. So they do get the right to vote, which we talked about, and we know that women can now vote. But the problem that we have is that there's no equal rights amendment. There's still no equal rights amendment. So technically, according to the Constitution, women aren't really fully protected as equal citizens. And so they really, really push this and try to get this passed. From 1919 to 1965, it was submitted every single year, and every single year it was denied and has not been ratified. The 1960s did pass the Equal Rights Amendment, but it did not get ratified and put into place. And even today, it's something that's still brought up, and it still hasn't been done. And one of the reasons in the 20s that they argued against it was they said that it would tear apart American families, that men would no longer be required to support women. And so there were all these arguments about what it would do to the American family if they made an equal rights amendment. They also argued that an equal rights amendment would mean that women could be drafted into the military, and this would disrupt families. And so all of this was a problem. You also have prohibition during this time. We talked about that, and we talked about some of the ways they got around it, but prohibition had a lot of unforeseen problems that they really just had no way of knowing was going to happen. It went into effect in January of 1920, and there's all sorts of consequences. One is the speakeasies we talked about. They weren't just fun. Speakeasies exist, people keep drinking, and people killed people in speakeasies. There is a whole criminal network that will be developed around prohibition. This whole organized crime network, the mafia is part of it, it's not all of it, but you will have this category of bootleggers, these professional smugglers that are going to get moonshine and, you know, create ways and networks to deliver the moonshine, and that's going to cause a lot of crime. And there's another link, so you're going to pause, go back to the PowerPoint, click on the NASCAR link. It should not have any problems. I've never had a problem with that link, and you're going to watch it, and then you're going to come back. Okay, so now you've watched the NASCAR video, and you realize how crazy it is that NASCAR only exists because of prohibition. And because of the involvement of the mob in prohibition, it led to violence, competing factions, issues with the police, and ultimately prohibition failed to even do what it was supposed to do, which was to stop drinking. It's eventually abandoned. So you see, these were not so roaring 1920s.